Hi everybody and welcome to my channel. Thank you for watching. Today I wanted to do something that is very special to me, and that is a review of some of my favorite books. I am a writer. I love to write. I studied journalism in college. I've wanted to write from a very, very early age, and part of what fueled that passion when I was young was my love of reading. And I still love to read. I don't get to read as often as I'd like, and by often I mean like every hour of every day. But aside from writing, it is one of my favorite things to do. So I have a collection of books here that I just picked out, a couple of my favorites, and I wanted to share them with you and tell you a little bit about why I love each one. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So for my first book that I want to show you guys, this is a book that almost everybody has read and is the biggest conversation starter. It is The Alchemist. So if you have not read The Alchemist, you've probably heard of The Alchemist. It is just a very inspirational book. It's a bestseller. And I actually did not read this until a few years ago. Everybody had been recommending that I read this book, and I kind of put it off until I ordered it on Amazon because I had a trip coming up and I wanted a book to read during the flight. And I got very limited time actually reading this book during the flight because I struck up a conversation with a gentleman from the Midwest who was a completely different life and background than me, who had also read this book, and it had inspired him, and I realized it has inspired so many people to follow their dreams, or as The Alchemist would put it, find their treasure. I love the quote on the back, to realize one's destiny is a person's only obligation. I think that the writing style itself is very interesting. It has a very kind of storytelling sort of feel to it. It's not written like a traditional literary work, which is part of the reason why when it was initially published it didn't receive the critical acclaim that it really should have for the lessons within it. But I think it just goes to also show from a writer's perspective that if you have an interesting message and you have something worth saying, that it's worth experimenting with different writing styles, because not every traditional writing style maybe fits the nature of the story that you're telling, and that is why I love this book. I love The Alchemist. So follow your dreams, find your treasure. So now that we're talking about books that I just think are beautifully written, we're going to jump into two of my favorites. One of them is more well-known, and then the other one is less heard of, but they are by the same author, and that is The Kite Runner and 1,000 Splendid Suns by Hosseini. So admittedly, I actually read 1,000 Splendid Suns before I read The Kite Runner, even though The Kite Runner is the book that's more popular. Everybody's read The Kite Runner, but 1,000 Splendid Suns is, in my opinion, one of my favorite books, if not my favorite book. I just think that the writing style is beautiful. It describes the life of two women in Afghanistan. The way that the author writes about women and writes about their experience, and it follows them throughout generations from the time that they were little girls to when they're adults. It's about love and about sacrifice, and just is a very beautifully written book. I really love good historical fiction as well. I'm a big historical fiction fan, and I just think that it's a very interesting perspective, especially to read, being in the West, and seeing a different perspective on the Middle East and on conflict. The way that the author, who is a man, by the way, describes the female perspective and writes about the female perspective of, love and of heartbreak and just female relationships in general. It's one of the most accurate depictions that I've really seen of a male writer describing a female psyche, which is the reason why I absolutely love this book. So yeah, 1,000 Splendid Suns, highly recommend this one. Also, a little side note here, you'll notice my books are very destroyed. I know for people who love to take care of their books, this can be kind of heartbreaking or disappointing, but I'm a big believer. If you want a nice looking book, get a Kindle or read off a tablet. My books have been to the mountains with me. They've been in the ocean, they've been shoved in backpacks, they've been dropped in bathtubs, they've been eaten over, they've been cried over. and I purchase a lot of them used as well. My books are well loved, so if you'll notice, my favorites are usually the ones that are the most beat up, because I take them with me everywhere. Okay, so we're going to move into a new genre here, and this is also one of my favorite genres, and that is science fiction. I love a good science fiction book. One of my favorites is When the Wind Blows by James Patterson. So I actually ended up first getting into James Patterson when I was in elementary school. It actually terrified my teacher because, you know, he writes about a lot of sex and violence and murder. And she walks up to, you know, our fifth grader's desk, and I have a book by James Patterson on my desk, which warranted a meeting with my mom. But it was actually James Patterson's young adult books, which are the Maximum Ride series, which are based on the adult novel When the Wind Blows. So I read Maximum Ride growing up, and then ended up jumping into When the Wind Blows as an adult, when I could handle the real truth of what genetic engineering looks like in science fiction. So the premise of the book is the children are genetic experiments. They are human-avian hybrid. Even though this book is set in the present, I think it's a very interesting perspective on any kind of genetic engineering, alteration of the genetic code. We're usually doing things that are simple, like making crops resistant to a certain pest, or finding cures for the illnesses or diseases. I think it's really interesting to see what it can be from like a fantasy sort of perspective, which is why I really love this book. So, When the Wind Blows, The Lake House, which is the sequel by James Patterson. Highly recommend these. I tore through this on the beach in like 2 days. And if you're younger, also recommend Maximum Ride, the young adult series as well. It's worth checking out, and there's quite a few books, so it's a big series to get through. So my next one, this is actually in progress. There is a film about this book, which I have not yet watched the film because I have not yet finished the book, and that is The Girl with All the Gifts. I love this book. So far, it follows the protagonist, who is a little girl. She is living in a post-apocalyptic society in an underground sort of bunker. She is strapped into a chair every day. She does not realize that she actually is, you know, I can't give any spoilers. Ugh. She may or may not, spoiler alert, have a craving for eating other people. She might be a zombie, but we don't know yet. I'm still at the point in the book where I'm trying to figure it out, but a writer's intuition and seeing the trailer for this all over the internet has led me to believe that's what it is. So I have another one. This one is lesser known, Honey Girl by Elisa Freeman. So I was actually given this book by a creative writing professor of mine. He had given out books to the class, and there was a big pile of them, and I had like 2 seconds to choose, so I don't want to say don't judge a book by its cover, but I totally judged this book by its cover. I had posted my own writing on Instagram right when I'd finished this book, and by chance, the author from the LA area had commented and liked my writing, and I remember I was so excited, and I was such a fangirl because I absolutely love this book. So this is a young adult book, and it's really cool because it takes place in Santa Monica, California, and I am a native Californian and am very familiar with the Santa Monica area. So the protagonist, Nani, is actually from Hawaii. She comes out to California. She's a surfer, and she's coming to terms with her sexuality and, you know, the fact that she is bisexual and she likes girls. And I think it's just a very unique perspective to read, and it's relevant. And it's uncommon to see books that take place that are young adult books in the 1970s that are discussing girls being attracted to other girls. And I think that it's just a very refreshing kind of book, and pretty cool that it takes place in LA, in our backyard. So, yep, Honey Girl, highly recommend this one. So in that same kind of coming of age category, one of the books that I really wanted to show you guys is Not That Kind of Girl by Lena Dunham. This was such a funny, good, relatable sort of read. Series of essays that, you know, she has written, and they're hilarious. There were times that I was just cringing for her. Like, it was almost like your girlfriend was talking to you and you're like, please, come on, like, don't do that. Don't make that decision. Was not expecting it to be as good as it was. I usually shy away from any kind of essays or memoirs that celebrities write. It's just not really my cup of tea. But this one definitely is hilarious and worth reading. Okay, so now we're going to move into the literary category. So these are just my favorite pieces of literature that I admire. We're going to start with a well-known classic, and that is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And I know this probably should have fit into the science fiction category, but I'm putting it into literature because everybody knows of this book, and if you don't know of this book, just look at our society today, because he predicted in 1958 that the world would be a place that was obsessed with pop culture and self-medicating and focused on outward appearance. And well, look at that. Decades later, here we are. If you don't know the premise of it, people are genetically designed, back to that genetic engineering, to be members of the working class. And it's just such a well-written, great book. There are just a lot of parallels that can be drawn between society today and society in this fictional book. If you are interested in things that are a bit dystopian or social commentary that didn't really mean to be social commentary, but somehow ended up being relevant social commentary, Brave New World, highly recommend. Okay, so now we're just going to get into writing that I love, and one of those is The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. So I have to say there are a few things that I love more than writers who write about writers, because they just know how they think. When you're a writer and you're reading about a writer, and a writer wrote it, though there's a lot of writers in that sentence, you just understand the thought process. So essentially, the premise of this novel is that there is a woman who is hired to write the biography of this very kind of reclusive, obscure, world-famous writer who has not given her life story yet. It has this kind of gothic sort of feel to the entire novel. I read it during the summer. This would be a great read during Halloween or maybe during any of the colder months. If I were to describe this in relation to any filmmakers, I'd say that it was very reminiscent of maybe Tim Burton, something very kind of creepy and just an eerie sort of feel to it. It goes back and forth between different periods of time. Sometimes you can't tell what's reality and what's fictional within the book, and it just has these plot twists, and I highly recommend this one, The 13th Tale, Diane Setterfield. For my next book, we are also getting into one of my favorites. This one is a bit more obscure. It's not as well known. I actually did buy this one at a used bookstore as well, and it came to the beach with me a lot, as you can see by the water damage that I have on this book. And this is The Mermaid Collector by Erika Marks. Are you really a writer if you don't have some fantasy in your head about living in the New England part of the US? I recently, in the fall, fulfilled one of my personal dreams, writing in a little coffee shop in New England on the outskirts of Boston in a little fishing town. This book kind of summarizes the entire reason why I really wanted to go and experience that. It is kind of a bit like historical fiction, a little bit of a romance. The novel takes place in the present day, but it keeps going back to the 1800s, to these events that had happened in this little fishing town regarding mermaids and the folklore that surrounds it. And it's just a very beautiful, beautiful book. So this book compelled me to follow my New England fantasy here and go right in a little fishing town. The Mermaid Collector, Erika Marks, highly recommend to anybody who is a writer, a fan of New England, a fan of folklore, a fan of historical fiction, or just wants like a very lyrically well-written sort of novel. There's this one. So for my final segment, I'm going to be going over my favorite books of poetry. So I love poetry because I feel like it's a great way to get your literary fix in very short, digestible pieces. One of my favorite ways to cure writer's block when I'm working on my own projects is to turn on a little bit of music and write a little bit of poetry. Just doesn't even have to be good, you just want the words to start flowing so you can get to working on your real piece that you actually have to write. All very, very different. The first one that I'm going to go through, anybody who has been on Instagram or gets like trendy sort of books probably has heard of Milk and Honey. I actually think that this is really cool. The book was written by a girl who became famous, Rupi Kaur. Rupi Kaur? Sorry, Rupi, if I butchered your last name. One of the things that I think is really neat about this is just the power that we have today of self-publishing. So The author actually did all of the poems, posted them on Instagram, did all of her own little illustrations, ended up publishing it, and next thing you know, everybody is reading it. Doesn't make an attempt at being flowery. It's more so very sort of just raw feeling to it. So I definitely recommend this, especially if, you know, you fall into the lover of pop culture, social media, 20-something or late teens kind of genre. It's a little bit angsty, and milk and honey. Next one is my personal favorite, and that is the Essential Rumi. And obviously all of these are translated to English. I have marked this book up so much. Whenever I see a verse that I absolutely love, I always highlight it, just because I think they're beautifully written and insightful and stand the test of time. But one of these that I love is, the sunsets sometimes look like the sun's coming up. Do you know what a faithful love is like? You're crying, you say you've burned yourself, but can you think of anyone who's not hazy with smoke? Oh, this one verse, I've made up so many love stories, now I feel fictional. And as a writer, you can just relate to that. I just, my favorite. I keep this in my bag, and whenever I have writer's block, I'll like go through and read some of the verses that I've highlighted, and I just find them to be very inspirational. So those are my favorite books. I actually have a full stack of them behind the camera as well. Hopefully you guys found some new favorites in there, or maybe you can just revisit some of your old ones. I will have all of the books that I discussed listed below. Just check it out in the description. So yeah, thanks for watching.